Hi. Before I made this video, I asked viewers what they'd like to know about the OP-1 field. And the question that kept coming up was, in light of its price, is it worth it? In this video, I'll address this question in comparison to the original OP-1 in detail, in comparison to other standalone hardware instruments like the MPC or Maschine Plus, and compare it to just making music with a laptop or iPad. Before I start, a quick disclosure. I got OP-1 field directly from Teenage Engineering and it cost me substantially less than retail. But as always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Let's start with the easiest comparison of them all. How does either OP-1 compare with making music on a laptop or iPad? And the answer is a laptop with an audio interface and microphone if you want to sample external instruments, and MIDI controller with a few knobs if you want hands-on controls and velocity sensitivity, can do way more than either OP-1 with either free or very inexpensive software and plugins, except maybe broadcast FM to a radio, but Bluetooth should work fine if your laptop can handle it. The keys on OP-1 aren't velocity sensitive, so it's arguable that you can use a laptop keyboard instead, though personally I don't find laptop keys nearly as playable. This layout is way more intuitive and has 2 octaves. So forget price, why even get an OP-1? Well, I can't speak for anyone else but me. I bought my original OP-1 not because I didn't know that a computer could do more, but rather despite the fact that an OP-1 can do way less, because I enjoyed the portability, especially when traveling, and the fact that it has a simplified interface without having to open multiple plugin windows with dozens of parameters. For me, quick access to sampling, whether it's through the internal microphone, over USB, and in particular radio, along with all the different sampling and synth engines that have relatively simple and easy controls, along with very interesting sequencers, meant that I could get going and explore ideas faster, and of course there's the Gorilla drummers. Now, that's not to say that either OP-1 is perfect, far from it. They both have their share of cons and frustrating aspects, which I'll talk about in the section where I compare them to other DAW-less gear. Okay, let's start with a comparison to the original OP-1. The only real advantage the original has is price, especially if you're willing to buy used, which is how I bought my first OP-1. Prices have been dropping on Reverb recently, so it doesn't cost that much, relatively speaking, compared to buying a new one of either one. And since you can always sell it if you don't like it, trying it out is either free or a rental if you sell it for less than what you bought it for, which shouldn't be that much if you buy used. I do recommend trying the original first because the core workflow is identical between the two. Yes, the OP-1 field is better in quite a few ways, but it costs a lot more. So if you're not comfortable with the core workflow, whatever OP-1 field is better at won't matter much. Assuming you find the tape-based workflow appealing, then it's a matter of whether the new hardware and firmware capabilities of OP-1 field are worth the price difference. There's a full list of everything that's new in OP-1 field on the Teenage Engineering website. In this video, I'll cover the ones that I think are the most material and the ones you can't really get a good feel for just by looking at a list. If I had to pick, the 2 most material differences, in my opinion, are the extra storage and new stereo support in tracks, instruments, and effects in OP-1 field. Let's start with storage. The original OP-1 has only one 6-minute tape with 4 mono tracks. You could create stereo mixdowns to 2 6-minute albums, but that's more of a one-time process recording a performance onto a stereo album. Most of the time you're working within the context of a 4-track mono tape. If you want to work on more than one idea at once with the original OP-1, you'd need to sort of zip around the timeline and just find your way around different spots on the tape, or you could back up the entire contents of the machine to a computer and just start fresh. The OP-1 field, on the other hand, can hold up to 8 tapes in memory. You can skip between the tapes very easily. There are 4 tape styles, which we'll get to later, but being able to very quickly load up a new project makes a huge difference because most of the time you'll want to work on more than one idea at a time. Each of these are also a 6-minute tape, just in stereo, so 4 tracks of 6 minutes in total. A word about these tapes, they're not really projects in the sense of entire machine states. They do save tape parameters like tempo along with the tape content, the audio tape content, but they don't save a lot of things which I think would have been nice had they been saved within the project, like different snapshots per project, meaning different sound or drum presets. I think it would be nice if mix levels were saved as well as global effects so that you could truly work on independent ideas for each tape. Tapes load up pretty much instantaneously. You can't load a tape while it's playing. So if I play this, playback will stop. But other than that, it's pretty much real time. A final word about storage. Aside from tape space, user snapshot or preset storage has been increased to 500. I'm not sure how that splits between synth presets, drum presets, and sampler presets, but that's at least 3 times the original OP-1. If you're using the sampler synth, let's maybe load that into here, then you're still limited to 6 seconds of samples on both OP-1s. But if you use sample-based drum kits, storage has been increased to 20 seconds per kit, as opposed to 12 seconds on the original OP-1. 12 or 20 seconds may not sound like a lot, but you've got 8 of these kits immediately accessible. So if you don't use any of the drum synth tracks, you could potentially have 160 seconds of samples immediately accessible through the 8 snapshots or 8 drum kits. And you don't need to use drum kits as such. You can create multi-sample instruments with them, or just use them as storage for long samples or even loops. When I hooked up the OP-1 field to my computer, it showed about 2.7 gigs of free space, and if you copy the entire drive, all 8 projects to your computer, it's about 3.7 gigs. Regardless if 2.7 gigs are available for user samples, which I can't confirm, that's quite a lot. The next big difference between OP-1 field and the original OP-1 is stereo support almost across the board. As you can see, samples are in stereo and tape records in stereo, and almost all the synths have been upgraded to stereo. So for example, if I go to, let's start with cluster and choose that here as well. So for example, if I choose, say, this patch on both, and I'll turn off the reverb on both to make it fair. So there's no stereo field on the original, and a bit more than a smidge on the OP-1 field. Let's go, say, for this one, mantra tone. And again, turn off any effects. This compared to this. It's nuanced, but check out our little stereoscope, how the stereo field changes as I play around with the arrangement of the operators, with the topology. So I won't go through all the synths, but the string synth has been upgraded to stereo as well, like many of the others. Same goes for the effects. I'll pick a patch that's relatively mono. Yeah, in both. So on the original OP-1, the effects that were in stereo, like spring or cow, only worked in stereo when you applied them as master effects as opposed to instrument effects. So say, for example, if we picked cow, then it's in mono. On the OP-1 field, effects that are in stereo when applied to the individual track, to an instrument, not just to the master. Same goes for, not the delay, oddly, but for grid. So also in stereo on the track level here, as well as, of course, the spring. Just to clarify, these effects are in stereo on the master on the original OP-1, but not on the track level. I already mentioned earlier that samples are in stereo. Aside from the samples being in stereo, both in drum kits and in melodic instruments, you can pan the drum instruments left and right. You can pan each sample, by the way, separately, if you wanted. There are also a few other tricks here, like, for example, choke groups. That's the little G over here. So 1 is just one-shot mode without choking the sample. And with G, it gets choked. Aside from regular panning, there's also the stacking feature, which lets you treat the left and right sides as layers. So for example, in this sample, they're a bit different. If I go ahead and put this encoder instead of left-right mode in stacking mode, then the sample will morph from playing the left side to playing the right side, or anything in between. And you can set this parameter as an LFO destination in, say, the value LFO. While we're on the topic of samples, the melodic samples were also improved with crossfades on the loop points. So that doesn't sound too good, but with a crossfade, it can sound pretty convincing. So really nice addition there. And a sorely missed feature on the original OP-1 is the ability to zoom in to any point on the melodic sample or drum kits just by pressing the encoder and moving it back and forth, either at the end or the start. Moving on, the next two big improvements in OP-1 Field are the new Dimension synth and the Mother reverb. Let's listen to Dimension first without the reverb. It's got a few waveforms and it morphs between them. Stereo width, filter with resonance. Let's also turn off the LFO so we can hear the whole range of the filter. With or without resonance. So really nice synth there. And then there's the reverb, Mother reverb. That can be quite spacious with color control, frequency control over the reverb, dry wet mix, and a gate if you want a gated reverb. But a really nice addition to the OP-1's palette. The next major improvement in OP-1 Field is its screen. It's an LCD screen as opposed to an OLED screen in the original OP-1, so extreme viewing angles may not be as good, but the new screen has a higher resolution in which we get quite a bit more information as to what's going on as opposed to the original OP-1. It's also a bit brighter and has a higher refresh rate. The screen is also flush with the surface as opposed to the original OP-1, which made seeing the tracks very hard. Tracks are also bigger here regardless, but the main benefit, like I mentioned, is the higher resolution screen, which means we get to see more information in quite a few places. In lists, for example, we see 9 parameters as opposed to only 6 per row here. And Teenage Engineering have kindly written what some of the parameters do on the screen as opposed to previously. So in synths like cluster or string, things are just written on the screen. So take a look at this. And then if they aren't written on screen, you get a little pop-up that shows you which parameter you're changing. So it's not as if you couldn't figure these out on your own, in most of the cases at least, on the original OP-1, but it's nice to have them written explicitly on the screen. Where this is most meaningful, in my opinion, is the LFO. So previously, if you wanted to modulate a destination, and speaking of which, on a side note, they took out the bend and crank LFOs from the OP-1 field. Anyway, back to the topic, I'll choose an LFO that's common to both OP-1s. then don't ask me why, because I think there is room on the screen here. Anyway, it wouldn't tell you the name of the destination. It would just show you the color of the knob that it was moving, and you had to put the two together, which could be an extreme pain with something like desynth. So I don't know about you, but I didn't enjoy this. Whereas here, let's go all the way to the extreme, to desynth, you just see the parameter name. How nice is that? And hopefully they'll find a way to add that here too. There are a few other cool visualizations here. For example, hopefully you see this on screen, but you see a spectrum analyzer here behind the EQ, and the encoder's got additional push functionality, for example, to mute tracks and to hold sequencers. So this is convenient. Just a quick press instead of turning the knob. I showed you earlier the stack samples functionality, and I think here as well for the EQ. You can A/B test EQ settings. Okay, let's move on and talk about audio quality. Before making this video, I asked viewers how you'd like me to test this, and here are a few tests that people asked me to conduct. If you have any other ideas, let me know in the comments section, and I'll update the description with the results. The first test is how the two pitch samples. So let's go into, these are a few samples I loaded up from OP-1 Fun. Now I'm going to level match these in post because the OP-1 field is louder than the OG OP-1. So I'll let you judge. Let's start transposing. Same exact sample in both cases. Let's go to the extreme. Let's try a different sample. In both cases, by the way, I've got the LFO and effects off. Let's try some extreme pitch shifting. Let's try one more. Same exact sample. Let's go up as high as we can. Hopefully it doesn't cause too much damage. Except for levels, which I adjusted for here, and a bit of noise, I don't think the difference merits the price. So that's one test. Another interesting test is effects quality. I did notice a bit of aliasing, grit, and noise, say on Nitro, on the original OP-1. Let's try lowering the resonance. And with resonance. You should watch how you're driving with the OP-1 field, because the police might get you. I won't go through all of these, but I did notice quite a difference in punch. So. So the OG OP-1 is distinctly more lo-fi, but then again, these days, who's to say that's a bad thing? Let's compare a few synth presets. OP-1 Field, by the way, has more presets, even for the synths that they have in common. Presets do include effects, by the way, even though the delay isn't in stereo at all. At least not in the current firmware. Let's maybe try a few more. Again, delay on both. We can turn it off. Certainly a difference. I picked this one because it's got a cool modulation going on. The modulation behavior is different. OG OP-1 sounds pretty good. Okay, let's move on. Speaking of reduction in quality, if the OP-1 field sounds too good to you, Teenage Engineering have added 3 new tape styles. So what I've been using so far is the Studio 4-track, that's the highest quality, and then the 3 other options are Vintage 4-track, Porta 4-track, and Mini Disc. For each one that you choose, you get a fancy animation, and I can see mini disc style hiccups here. Now, there are a few odd or different things about the way that these are implemented here. First, when you create a project, you need to commit to a tape type. So if I created this project or a new project using the mini disc type, then I couldn't now swap to Vintage 4-track mode without deleting this project and creating a new one. The second odd thing, which kind of makes sense when you think about it, is that the effect is applied only when you record something to tape. So let's, for example, choose the lowest quality option, which is the Porta 4-track. Now, I actually can't create a new project until I delete one of my older ones because I've maxed out the available projects, and I can't delete the one that I just created before I load up an old one. So now I can choose this and delete it. So now let's go back here, Porta 4-track. Now I can make a new tape. So if I now play my synth in this project and in the studio quality project, let's just load this one, I can't hear a difference. It's only when you record that it's relevant. So let's go back into Porta, into my new project. So same quality, but you'll notice when I hit record, you can hear the tape hiss. So here's where how this is implemented is a bit challenging. If I preview my music, it'll be as it is without the tape effect. If I start recording though, it'll be with the effect and a bit of tape distortion. So what you preview isn't exactly like what you get. If I wanted to overdub, then I could, let's maybe start here and overdub this. But now I've added another layer of noise on top of that. You might notice the noise was a bit louder there. If not, it's just easy to create a simple in and out point and just hit record. Notice the noise increase for every pass. So this is relevant if you create overdubs or just record different levels of noise. You'll hear that noise bump, and the tape makes no noise if there's nothing recorded onto it. Now you can copy and paste audio between projects. So let's say go into let's go for a high quality one and just this one. So let's record. Okay, I've got a clean recording of this. Let's lift it and drop it just in case. Then go into my Porta project. Let's just drop this over here. So now we've got noise and then a very clean recording. Let's extend this loop a bit. So my point is that it's not the tape that's lo-fi, but rather the processing that's applied when you record to it. If this is indeed the case and I didn't miss anything, I think it would be nice if they'd let you change tape styles mid-project so that you can apply different character to different tracks or different portions of your song. Now there are a few more differences. I guess like in the tape stop between this, especially maybe if we go into, say, the mini disc, you can hear disc lo-fi is much more subtle. So as we fast forward, you get these sort of mini disc style artifacts. Maybe also when you stop the tape. Anyway, that's how it works. Mini disc is probably the closest to digital, and we saw that the Porta was the lowest quality. Vintage is sort of in between Studio and Porta. And one last thing in this respect, if you want to preview the audio before recording it, because if I were to hit record now and play, then it would start recording. If you want to preview what something sounds like without recording it, you hold Shift, record, and stop. And then you can preview the noise and distortion, if any. Anyway, so those are the tape styles. Let's move on and take a look at a few more differences. The OP-1 Field got a new sequencer called the hold sequencer, which actually isn't a sequencer at all. It does two things. The first is hold a chord below a split point. So if I set the split point here, I'll be able to play on top of the chord without interrupting the split. And the second cool thing that it does is transpose the chord, which is kind of like a strumming effect. So it's not really a sequencer, more just a really cool performance function. Let's move on to more differences in terms of connectivity and interfaces to the outside world. They seem similar, but there's more under the surface. Both have an analog stereo input and output, but the headphone port on OP-1 Field also accepts headphones with a microphone. Both have a USB port for charging, MIDI, and stereo audio. Mini USB on the original OP-1 and USB-C on the Field. And since they send audio back and forth, you can, for example, plug in a computer or iPhone and sample audio from it directly. The main new thing about OP-1 Field's USB-C port is that it can act as a USB host as opposed to only a USB device on the original OP-1. This means you can connect an external MIDI controller directly to it, and it will power it too. I don't know what the power specs are, but I connected it to a Launchpad Pro over USB-C as well as to a KeyStep with a USB-C to A adapter, and it seemed to work fine. Both have a microphone, but the microphone on OP-1 Field is a lot better. And the ukulele has been waiting patiently for this moment, and this too. Let's record this. So that's the mic. While we're on the topic of the recording options, both have an FM radio option, but the OP-1 Field also has an FM transmitter. And then the last advantage OP-1 Field has over the original OP-1 is Bluetooth for MIDI, though. You can't broadcast audio over Bluetooth, and you can't send audio to it over Bluetooth, at least not in this firmware. You access Bluetooth in the comm settings, then go ahead and advertise the fact that you've got Bluetooth, and go to the list of Bluetooth devices and hit pair. So we've got it paired, and velocity is already impacting level, but I could go into the LFO, choose the velocity LFO, point that into amp and into, where are you at? Cutoff. So now, the harder I hit the note, the more the filter opens up. Finally, I guess it's a form of connectivity. There are two Velcro circles on the bottom of the OP-1 Field, and you get two of these with stickers. So you could stick this anywhere you want and then Velcro your OP-1 to it. Next up, the speaker, super improved on the OP-1 Field. There's a side grill and a bottom grill, which substantially enhances bass. And I'll use my mic for this. So the OG is okay with high frequencies. The situation changes completely, however, using lower frequencies. Just literally can't hear any of the bass notes at all. Same preset, by the way. So the speaker on OP-1 Field is actually quite good, though of course it doesn't compare to using headphones or external speakers, and it isn't in stereo. The last major thing on my list is the battery. The specs claim 24-hour battery life, and I did indeed leave this on and it lasted as much, but I have to say battery life on the original OP-1 is excellent as well. So those are the main things. There are a few other nice to have features like the ability to name snapshots or presets here. On the original OP-1, you'd need to do that on a computer. There are a few additional LFO destinations. There's per patch volume and bend range, which is pretty useful if you want finer control of gain staging in your project. There are enhanced system settings, so a few more things that are under your control like brightness. And there are a few additional settings related to MIDI. If you connect a computer to this, there's both MTP and disk mode. Disk mode is a bit slower, MTP is faster and gives you access to more content on the OP-1. So that is more or less how OP-1 Field compares to the original OP-1. Let's talk about how OP-1 compares to other grooveboxes or production centers, instruments like the MPC, Maschine, Deluge, MC707, Poly and Play, and so on. So there are, of course, many differences even amongst those, not to mention to OP-1, but there are a few big picture things you need to know about OP-1 that makes it very different from anything else. Probably the biggest difference is the tape-based workflow of OP-1, meaning that for any type of music making beyond just playing a single preset or drum kit at a time, you create songs on the OP-1 by layering and recording the audio of live performances into audio tracks. Now the OP-1 does have quite a few built-in sequencers, but these are short sequences anywhere between 16 steps for pattern, up to 32 in finger and 128 in endless. But you can only use one of these at a time and actually only store one of these at a time, with the exception of finger. That lets you store 14 patterns on board, only 2-note polyphony per pattern, but you can combine 2 patterns at a time. Anyway, these are fun and creative, and I didn't talk about Tombola and Sketch. All good stuff, but all short sequences. If you want to create an actual track or a song, you're going to need to record them as audio into the tape. This is as opposed to most groove boxes, which are built around MIDI tracks and often support both MIDI and audio. In the case of, say, the MPC, Maschine, or Deluge, the benefit of using MIDI tracks is that if you make a mistake or change your mind about a single note or a single automation that you made, you can typically go back and edit that individual note or automation, whereas with a tape or audio track style workflow, you'll typically need to re-record all or at least that portion of the performance, and good luck if that performance had overdubs with multiple takes. Aside from the OP-1 sequencers being relatively short, you can only store MIDI notes in them, not automation. Though a little workaround is if you're using a kit, then you can set the levels for each sample in a kit and then say have 2 kicks, one with a louder level and one with a lower level. Another disadvantage of the OP-1 is that it only has 4 tracks. Once you've used those up, you can still overdub audio, meaning just record audio over something that you've already recorded, but there's no undo in that case, with the exception that you can lift a segment, and then that gets copied into temporary memory. You drop it back into the timeline, and then if you make a mistake while overdubbing, then you can drop it again and go back to the original. You can also copy all 4 tracks if you like, and then don't forget to drop them back in the original place, and then you can also paste them somewhere else. So if you make a mistake here, you can always revert to the original. So there are workarounds for the lack of undo, but regardless, even if there was undo, you're still dealing with audio as opposed to MIDI data. Then the second big difference between either OP-1 and other grooveboxes or production machines is that the OP-1 isn't multitimbral, with the exception of drum machines. So drum machines can contain multiple samples, multiple timbres, and you can play them together, and you can swap out drum kits really easily. but it's always just one at a time. Same for the sounds, right? Loading up a new sound immediately cuts out the previous one. So it's one timbre at a time at any given point. Now, of course, once you commit everything to multi-track tape, then it's multi-timbral in that respect. But again, that's burned into tape. If you want to change that, you'll need to find the original sound per track, delete the tape or overdub and so on. So that's the second big difference. The next big difference is that typically with other groove boxes, you'll have way more parameters for each of the synth engines, way more parameters for the effects, more envelopes, more LFOs. This as opposed to the more minimalist controls for the OP-1, typically just 4 parameters for each of the synths, a bit more for the sampler, a simple amplitude envelope, a simple effect, single effect per instrument. There's also a master effect, but you can't chain effects on a specific instrument. And then on the modulation side, you've got an LFO. There are actually 6 LFO types, though only 3 of them are really LFOs. The others are just either MIDI modulation, velocity sensitivity, and element, which is a few sources applied to a destination in the patch. Sources, by the way, can be the envelope, audio, so an envelope follower basically, or the accelerometer. So certainly things are simpler here. I don't think there's a right or wrong on the topic of simplicity versus complexity. Sometimes we want more control, in which case you'll need to go DAWless with a MPC or Maschine or so on. And sometimes you want less clutter, in which case the OP-1 is perfect. So from all of the above, you can see OP-1's focus isn't necessarily the longest list of features. The main pros for OP-1 are that it's ultra portable, it has a focused workflow, no menus, it has fun sequencers. I like to travel light, and nothing beats the form factor and portability of the OP-1. Fact is, I've never taken an MPC or Maschine with me on trips or on trips to the couch, but I have taken an OP-1. I guess the question is, where do you go to explore simple musical ideas? For me, especially when traveling, despite having a laptop and often certainly a phone or iPad with me, the OP-1 was always my first choice, especially since it's so quick at sampling radio or external audio through the mic. Though if I wanted to work on a complex idea, or certainly one with more than 4 tracks, I wouldn't do it on the OP-1. So ultimately, it's about what inspires you to create. The tape may be something that's totally frustrating for you. If you're fine on a laptop, phone, or iPad, all of which are also portable, you probably don't need an OP-1 regardless of how much it costs. So that's it in terms of the comparison. Before I wrap up the video, I wanted to mention a few wishlist features that I hope Teenage Engineering will add in the future. Obviously, top of the list for me and many others is undo. It's particularly important when overdubbing. I think that lack of undo isn't that big of a deal if you're just recording to an empty track. Worst case, you just delete what you recorded and start again. That said, even if you don't want to overdub, you might find yourself needing undo because you or me forgot to change the track before recording. If it's an issue of lack of memory, by the way, I'd gladly give up 30 or 60 seconds of tape and use that as an undo buffer. Another important limitation that I hope they'll find a way to fix, if you try to lift multiple tracks that are more than 22 seconds long, you can't do that. The limit for one track, by the way, is 90 seconds, not the whole 6 minutes of tape. I don't really understand that limitation since there's so much free storage on the OP-1 field. Hopefully they'll be able to overcome that. Speaking of storage, it would be nice to have more than 8 projects, and I wouldn't mind setting, say, less than 6 minutes per project if I wanted more projects, or maybe even have fewer projects if I wanted a longer song. And speaking of projects, I call these projects, but they're really tapes. It would be nice if each tape stored the entire machine state alongside the tape and would truly be a project. Like I mentioned earlier, I'd like to have the different synths I have here as shortcuts go along with every tape. Same goes for drum machines and for other mixer and master settings. For example, I may have chosen to apply completely different compression settings on one tape as opposed to another. Another wish list feature, and I know that this is blasphemy, but this tape animation, while very cool, takes up a lot of space. Really, what I care about here is not the, by the way, exquisite animation of the tape moving from one reel to the other, but what I want to do is actually have a better view at my 4 tracks and see what's going on there. So it could be a toggle if people really like this tape animation, but ideally I would want to see the tracks just like I see the different drum samples in a kit. So I'd argue there's enough room on the screen to show the waveforms for all 4 tracks. In terms of future synths, it would be nice to have a granular synth option. Hopefully there's enough CPU power for it here. And then finally, I'd like not to have the little hiccup when you swap tracks. The OP-1 can actually be quite a good live looper. You set in points and out points and just jam different ideas into different tracks, but the hiccups when swapping tracks kind of interrupts the process. So that's it for OP-1 Field. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.